Hmm. We'll see. That was weird. Wonder if I got zapped, but looks like it's working. Folks, I want to do this live after everything that happened yesterday, which was just epic. And then, of course, the tragedy of Charlie Kirk and much more going into now 9/11 today, this morning. And now we have 9/10, 9/11. And a lot of Christians seemingly are ignorant of reality and how we got to where we are today. And then this really upsets me with what are called social conservatives. And I talk about this quite a bit these days. And it's really at a tragic loss of Charlie Kirk, which was a voice for young people. And when I say that, I mean people born for me, my generation, those prior to me, who lived in a different time, a different truth, a North American truth that, again, if you were born after 1984, you have no reference to the Western world as it was prior to that. What do I mean? How did we get to 9/11? How did we get to yesterday, 9/10, Charlie Kirk? How do we get to where Christians are today out west in really explosive ignorance? Well, believe it or not, it's all based off Canada and a corruption of the United States of America. I watched the video on the Charlotte train of the refugee, the Ukrainian refugee who was stabbed. I watched all 4 minutes of video. For me at my age, my experience in life, how I grew up born in the 70s, and what I watched transition out of Canada, which has many, many more years on the USA in mental health and mental health sanitariums than the United States of America. USA transitioned after Canada. It's a lot more fresher, and it's absolutely based on Canada and Canada's corruption of the United States. For those who don't know, Medicaid came in 65, 10 years after the Medicare Act of Canada. There was even an earlier act in the 50s, which started to do away with mental health facilities, specifically sanitariums. Again, unless you were born prior to 1984 and you were raised in any time period before that, you don't know what I'm talking about. You don't know about a world where mental health issues were not public the way they are today. What do I mean by that? I mean that people with serious mental illness were locked away in large, privately run facilities, not released into communities, not left to flourish. Folks, Charlie Kirk was assassinated yesterday. If you haven't seen the brutal video, a sniper at a range of 200 yards executed him. Now, they rounded up everybody within the 200 yards. They arrested two folks, two persons of interest, who've now been released. As of this morning, now almost an hour ago, they're still on a manhunt looking for the Charlie Kirk assassin, a professional sniper, well-trained, totally different than the Charlotte train murder that was clearly completed by a mentally deranged human being. How folks can't distinguish that is absolutely a reality of an institutionalized system, a crossover of Canadian institutionalization to the United States of America. Birthed in 1965 in the United States under the guise of Medicaid. It was the transition in doing away with large sanitariums, largely Christian-based, where now folks who require massive medications just to be functional in society are released into the public, and largely at their own discretion. If you don't have the finances to pay for your medicines, your medications, you go off the charts, you go cuckoo. And that's clearly the case we have with the murderer in the Charlotte train killing. If you haven't seen it, you can clearly see he's agitated. You watch 2 minutes before she even gets on the train, they release the video of him being agitated. Something's communicating with him in his own mind, in his own reality. And then she just happens to sit in front of him. And of course, the mental illness takes over. If you can't distinguish the difference between someone in the community who's completely mentally unstable and a political assassin, a sniper, a planned, well-executed assassination, I don't know what to tell you. You're what's wrong with Christianity today. You're what's wrong with the world. And again, folks born after 1984 have no reference to the way the world was, Western world was, before 1984. I grew up in that. I watched the transition. I watched just in my home province of Alberta that was probably the most furthest along in sanitariums. I'm not saying all righteousness here, but largely those with serious mental illness were removed from communities quickly. Absolutely. There was no process of them going to jail. If your crime was of a crazy nature, a sick, sadistic nature, you went into a sanitarium, and I promise you it was worse than prison. Now, I'm not saying that human rights are not important or these civil rights movements aren't important. I'm saying that there was a transition with Canada's system of universal health care from that model that removed mental illness from society, where we knew the risks to the community, families and children, outweighed those human and civil rights, because these people are extremely unstable. And why would you want to release that upon a community? Well, that's the way the world is. That's how laws are in both now USA and Canada. Canada being first, its model was what USA adopted 10 years after Canada. Another migration of Canadian perversion over the United States, and accepted largely via conservatism in the United States. They accepted it without really looking into the details of the truth. Charlie Kirk was an excellent debater. Things I never agreed with Charlie Kirk on came right down to biblical teachings of Jesus Christ. You cannot find a passage by Jesus Christ written by those of his era and with him at the time, meaning the apostles who wrote on Jesus. You can't find a single gospel scripture written by those with Jesus at the time of Jesus that has anything to do with justification of the murder of children or the infanticide of children. There is not a single publication. This is where I diverge with a lot of Christians. I don't believe them to be truly Christian. I put them in Old Testament Judaism, and that's fine. That is on the lines of an Islamist and a Judaist. There's not a whole lot of difference between them because they both don't recognize Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Neither do. And you have a right to believe what you want to believe. But when you take the word Christian and you say, I'm of Christianity, or I'm a faith based out of Christianity, where I say New Testament and the teachings of Jesus Christ are what I believe in, And then you create a hybrid and you say, well, I believe in Jesus to a point of justification where I say it's okay for infanticide in the following categories. Folks, the reason why I bring up Medicaid and Canada's universal health care, and its two acts are basically the same thing federally, is because sanitariums, and Alberta being the oldest model in all of North America. I've been crucified by the left. My life threatened. I was on a podcast with a number of African Americans who really wanted to paint a picture of me being some kind of evil, racist, pervert. All of it. I get it over and over. But really, it was all about heritage in Alberta and the birth of the sanitariums and just how far on the spectrum that went. Through Catholicism, largely, it was largely led by Catholics and Anglicans. That's the truth. Yes, it does residential school genocide. Yes, it does massive, massive evils upon people, especially mental illness, people who were neutered like a pet or an animal because of their mental illnesses. Now, I'm not saying any of that was right. What I'm saying is that at certain levels of mental illness where you lose faculty and control, you become murderous, you become a danger to children, to women, to people in your community, I do believe that sanitariums are appropriate at that stage, at that level of violence that's possible. Now you can say, listen, we have community support workers, we medicate people. Yeah, sure, as long as they have the money or taxpayers can support that. But the reality is, as time has been going on since 1984, this model has proved to not only be ineffectual in Alberta, and that largely all the crimes that exist now in mass proportions, especially in places like Alberta, compared to what it was pre-1984. And then you look at the United States, that all that's migrated to, the rest of Canada, you see homelessness. You realize that these obscene crime rates have exploded since 1984 and gotten worse. And you can chase it absolutely to mental illness and people released into the community. Of course, the massive homelessness associated with severe mental illness, and then the inability to afford the medicines that were affordable throughout the 50s and 60s, where there was an argument to support that. But of course, Big Pharma became so big and so expensive that what was regulatory and able to be done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up through the early 80s, by the 90s, we just watch it fall off. And people, largely with these severe mental illnesses, are untreatable. And Medicaid, Canada's universal health care, is completely inadequate. There's no amount of taxpayer funding to support or justify releasing people into the community at such rates of drug prices that nobody can afford. So these people are extremely mentally ill, quite capable of murderous, heinous acts that should not be out in the public, let alone walking the streets in mass numbers, are out there, unmedicated, unwatched, unsupervised, free to commit heinous crimes, because they will. They will, and they do every day of the week. It's been normalized. And we have Christians, largely born after 1984, or folks who just don't know any better because they didn't live in a period of the sanitarium, where this wasn't abundant as it was. You've heard videos of people like myself who grew up in the 70s and 80s. Children played outside late at night. Parents didn't really watch their kids, say, oh, look at all the things that could have happened. Well, those things did happen, but not nearly at the rates as they do now, because there are no more sanitariums. Meaning when people were acting out on these mental illnesses, they were quickly grabbed in the community, taken in, assessed in a 90-day in one of these sanitariums. And if they were in these conditions, diagnosed severe that way, they would never see the light of day. It was a life sentence, just like in prison, you'd be handed a life sentence for your mental illness. Now, people can say that's not right. It's a human rights violation. You're dehumanizing people. But if people are out in the community unmedicated, capable of murdering children, murdering people, raping children, they have these issues that can't be controlled without major medications. And we know the price tag of such medications are up here. Why would you release them when you know they are not going to be in an economic state to afford such medications? And that's where we are today. In fact, these people not only can't afford the medications, they can't even afford to live normal lives in a home and everything else, which compounds the mental illness. I don't have all the answers. I just know that was not a community reality prior to 1984 in Canada or the United States of America, as it is prevalent and epic on scale as it is today. And what really bothers me is conservatives don't see this today. They don't acknowledge it. They don't see it. Definitely the left loves that because it justifies more and more public sector, more and more public sector use of funds, even though they've legislated officially no way out of this situation, no effectual way out of this situation. In fact, they've legislated it so it will only get worse and worse over time, and Canadians and Americans will get broker and broker, and they're broken public institutions. Now, I put other quotes in this title that I wanted to address, that I've kind of let off with this, and people should do their own research. You can look up the terms I've given in this opening for themselves, and you will learn these truths. Whether you like it or not, you will learn these corrupt truths of a broken system migrated from Canada to the USA. And absolute corruption during the JFK era, and absolute corruption of America by Democrats adopting a Canadian model system that doesn't effectually work. In fact, it's more on that Marxist-Leninist style system where they get the public afraid. They get the public afraid of each other and communities broken down. If you break the community, you can really target the family unit. You can corrupt the family unit, which prior to 1984, prior to 1960 Canada, 1965 USA, they had dealt with the family unit. They had put that first, family unit first. And through socialist practices, they've corrupted that at the family unit level, absolutely through the community itself, at the grassroots level of community. Now, I hit Charlie Kirk Israel. I want to talk about children. I want to talk about Christianity and children. I want to talk about how Jesus never, ever once, there's no publication ever where he justifies any killing of children. In fact, it's everything opposite of that. So when you say you're Christian, Charlie Kirk, evangelicals, Canadian Catholics, you can go on and on, real Christians, New Testament Christians, accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, accepting even born again, accepting the fact that children are not to be compromised. Now we talk about abortion. Well, let's talk about Israel. There is no justification, none whatsoever, to justify any attempt of Israel murdering Palestinian children the way they are. If you don't believe in abortion, you can't possibly justify the horrific death toll of Palestinian children. You can't. There's no justification. It does not matter. As Jesus said, what evil bestowed and fell upon a peoples, as horrific as that is. And that means I am not justifying Hamas in any way, shape, or form. But as a Christian, you cannot ever, in your wildest imagination, under the guise of Jesus Christ and all his teachings, justify murdering all those Palestinian children in the name of any crime committed against any Israeli children or Israeli people. There is no justification. And as Jesus Christ himself said, it will be those who will suffer in the after, the worst imaginable under God. You want to talk about severe penalties in hell? According to Christian teachings, Christian teachings of Jesus Christ, that's the most horrible crime you can commit, right out of Jesus Christ's mouth himself, by those who walked and were with Jesus Christ and wrote about him entirely. So I don't know, unless you're going to burn your Bible, rip up your New Testament and say, hey, forget all that. I'm jumping back to Old Testament, eye for an eye. You kill a child, I kill your children, and you want me to support you. There's no justification in that. In fact, if you're against abortion, but yet you support someone who's murdering children, infanticide, the worst crime listed by Jesus Christ, clearly the worst crime you can commit, you'll be hard-pressed to find it's impossible to find any teaching of Jesus saying anything other than that infanticide is the worst crime you can commit against God. That is the most lowly human being there is. There's no justification. So right there, I have a problem with anyone in the conservative side of things and social conservative trying to use that as a justification. Now, I nail 9/11 in this too. I tag this day 9/11. And this day, I have a pile of conservative folks on that right extreme. 9/11 didn't happen. It was all fake. Well, I can tell you there were four planes that went down. 2 hit the towers. 1 hit the Pentagon. They call it the War Center now. And 1 went down in a field. There was communication between those planes, a number of those planes. And of course, the one plane, Flight 93, nobody ever likes to talk about on this day. Those who try to say, oh no, it didn't happen, it was the government, it wasn't Islamist extremist government involved. All those folks on Flight 93 fought back. They crashed that plane in a field and saved from crashing into the Capitol right there in Washington, D.C. Would have been massive casualties. I know, I've been to Washington, D.C. I see how people surround the White House. I see the Strip. And casualties of 3,000, almost 3,000, could have easily been 6 or more, including the President of the United States and their family. Could have easily been that. But those people fought back. The records of all the Islamic extremists are there. People don't like to look at the 19 who clearly did this, worked it out, planned it. People still don't want to admit that. That happened. That happened. And to not acknowledge that on 9/11, still after all these years, in massive evidence of Islamist extremism, is a real detriment to Christianity. Those on the supposed right who still chase these fantasies that something else occurred, something nefarious with the government, the communications of those brave Americans on that flight who took on those extremists and brought that plane down. Nobody ever talks about Flight 93. And I just want to bring that up today in this video as an important reminder that people can stand and deliver. And that's probably the greatness of America. Be angry at what happened with Charlie Kirk. Be angry at the attack on America that happened this time, September 11th, 2001. Be angry and always remember, never forget. But don't let people sway you into false narratives. If you're a Christian believer, remember Jesus' teachings, remember truths. Infanticide is not of Jesus Christ. If you justify that or you participate in that narrative, you're not for Jesus, you're not Christian, you're something else. And that's okay, but be honest about that. If you want to be a Judaist, say you're a Judaist. Don't claim Christian to bolster your numbers and your podium. If you're an Islamist, be Islamist. Don't be Christian, because they're not the same. That is the difference between Judaist and Islamist, is that you believe in Jesus Christ. And if you do, you don't justify infanticide. You never do. You never do. You certainly don't, in the name of Jesus Christ, support any violence. You don't ignore mental illness. Jesus Christ never ran from illness. Certainly not mental illness. Certainly not the worst diseases known to man of the time. He didn't run from any of that. He took it head on. You will be hard-pressed to find any teachings of any Judaists or Islamists ever doing the same. There's no such history of either of those religions. Lepers were isolated. Lepers were off, stoned, killed, murdered. This was universal between both religions. They didn't have any kind of love of any of that. Mental illness was met with the death penalty. You were demonized. That's the difference between Christian, Judaist, and Islamist. And again, if you need to remove Jesus and jump to Old Testament to justify your position, it's okay. Just don't call yourself Christian. Don't say, I'm a Christian, I'm born again, I'm all these things. I love Jesus, but I'm not going to follow his teachings in the Bible. I'm going to throw that out whenever I like. This is the problem with the social conservative. I've given a lot of truth here in this video. I ask people to share it out on this day, 9/11. And now a new day, 9/10, Charlie Kirk's day. And remember the difference, folks. Charlie Kirk was assassinated for his beliefs. Don't confuse that with a mentally unstable human being on a train and equate these two things as the same, because they're not. Charlie Kirk was politically assassinated by a trained killer. The refugee Ukrainian who died on a train was killed by a released, mentally unstable, mentally sick, well-documented individual that any common sense Christian conservative can watch both videos, and you should be able to determine the difference. If you were born before 1984, you should know the difference. That the guy on the train in the Charlotte killing was mentally unstable, and belonged in a sanitarium that you likely grew up with and remember a time, at least in your childhood, or at least as an adult raising children from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you knew that you could count on the system to lock those people straight away, remove them from society, and put the family unit first. Whether we like to admit these truths or not, I'm not saying that the movements in the 60s to address the evil sanitariums is wrong. I'm just saying that what was available in the late 50s, at least in Canada, early 60s Canada, then mid 60s, 70s, and early 80s of all of Western civilization is no longer affordable today. It hasn't been affordable since the 90s. And in fact, the system has ballooned the amount of crazy released into society and on the streets every day, killing because they don't belong in society. They're not fit for community. And we can dump all the socialism we want into it. The problem is only going to escalate and compound higher and higher and higher. And that sanitariums were effectual, were the right thing. How we run those, how we regulate them, the checks and balances over them, I believe is the issue at hand. And saying that, oh no, these people need to be made a part of the community, well, that's all fine and dandy if it's common sense affordable. But if it isn't, and you know these people can't afford their meds and the system can't provide those meds, and it hasn't been affordable since the 90s, and in fact, we're on a downward spiral back in the stone ages of mental health and public security and trust. If you haven't figured out who's the enemy here, you should. Go look at the birth of Medicaid, United States of America. Go look at JFK and where it migrated from, Marxist-Leninism, out of Canada, out of Canada's Universal, and everything before that. And if you thought it wasn't done with conservatives, you're sadly mistaken. Go look at Diefenbaker, Canada. There you'll find it. There's Tommy Douglas, sure, 1962. But what about 1956 and 57? Oh, no answer for that. Go look at the Universal Acts made in Canada that transitioned America into Medicaid. Go look. Go look. There's always two sides to a coin. I've long since known the evil of the Liberal, the NDP, at least in Canada, a lot longer than the corruption of the Democrats in the United States. But now I focus on the corruption of the social conservative, who at least in Canada is liberal conservative, known as progressive conservative. This has rotted the American right out, rotted the American system out. And if people don't see that, I don't know what to tell you. This video's epic, truthful, honest. There's key dates, key names, key titles of acts, legislation, and then markers that transitioned America. Migration. We call it comparative law, comparative political science, comparative economics. I give you all that. In truth, what corrupts America, what corrupts the American Christian. That for the longest time, all the way from 1635, largely all the way up to Reconstruction phase, right up to World War II, USA was largely untouched by all that corruption of Canada. It wasn't until the 50s that Canada really started warping so many Democrats and so many Northern Democrat states. You can look at the corruption of California, absolutely New York, and many, many other states. You can look at Colorado. You can look at that. And you'd be surprised how many social conservatives are no different than the liberals they purport to hate. But when you find them in social conservatism, you find they're the crafters and creators of this corruption, this attack on America, more often than you find the liberals. Not that the liberals didn't say, hey, great idea, we're going to double down on that, thank you. But you'll find that right out of Canada. And it's amazing that so many people won't take the acts, the history, the truth of it, and look at that as it is. Where did USA get its Medicaid? Where did it get its move to that centralized socialism? Diefenbaker. That's my video. Share, share, share. Get it out there. Know the difference between what's Christian and what isn't. What's Islamist or Judaist. Again, I have no qualms about any religions. I don't. But just remember, when you throw away the New Testament, when you say no to Jesus Christ's teachings, that's okay. That's your right to do so. But please, take the word Christian out of your narrative. Don't hide in nominations of Christianity and call yourself a specific Christian and throw away Jesus Christ and his teachings. Because as soon as you do that, Christian, you've taken Christ out. You're something else. And it's okay. Be Judaist, be Islamist, or be a number of other things, but don't call yourself Christian, because it isn't. And I know, at least in Canada, I know Americans don't see this, but in Canada, we see the transition into Islam. We see the Israeli transition, the unconstituted customary law system, the civil law socialism. We see it. We see it in our parliament and our legislatures. The face of it's there. And it's become majority, even though apparently these are minority percentages of the population. It's scary, it's awful, but it's the truth. On this day, 9/11, that I pay tribute to, at least to the truth of Flight 93. If folks don't know about it, please go research that. If you've forgotten, or you've been so obsessed with the towers that you've forgotten about the other 19, the total 19, and the 4 flights. That's my video. Share, share, share. God bless. Get it out there. Bye now.